Citizens, society, and the state. As leadership of the country has passed from Mao to Deng to Jiang Zemin to Hu Jintao and then to Xi Jinping, the relationship of Chinese citizens to the state has changed profoundly. Under Maoism, virtually no civil society was allowed, and the government controlled almost every facet of citizens' lives. Since the transition to a market-based economy began in 1978, important transformations have occurred in the citizen-state relationships. Party leaders realized that most citizens no longer see communist ideology as central to their lives. As a result, the Chinese Communist Party now appeals to patriotism and traditional pride in being Chinese. The message is that China's economic resurgence in recent years is a reemergence of the great ancient Chinese empire, but now under communist leadership. For example, the party state has done all it could to tout its leading role in China's economic achievements, winning the 2008 Summer Olympics for Beijing and returning Hong Kong to Chinese control. Ethnic cleavages. China's ethnic population is primarily Han Chinese, the people that historically formed the basis of China's identity, first as an empire and eventually as a country. China's borders have long included other ethnicities, primarily through conquest and expansion of land claims in Asia. Minority groups now comprise only about 8% of the PRC's population, but their autonomous areas, such as Tibet and Xinjiang, make up more than 60% of China's territory and have a long history of resistance to the Chinese government. There are 55 officially recognized minority groups, and no one minority is very large. Even so, the Chinese government has put a great deal of time and effort into its policies regarding ethnic groups. Most minorities live on or near China's borders with other countries, and most of their areas are sparsely populated. For example, Mongols live in Mongolia and China, and Kazakhs live in both the Kazakh Republic and China. Because dissidents are a long way from areas of dense population, China is worried that they may encourage independence or join with neighboring countries. Even though the percentages are not high, China does have about 100 million citizens who are members of minority groups, a huge number by anyone's calculations. By and large, the government's policy has been to encourage economic development and suppress expressions of dissent in ethnic minority areas. Most of China's minorities are in the 5 autonomous regions of Guangxi, Inner Mongolia, Ningxia, Tibet, and Xinjiang. The Chinese constitution grants autonomous areas the right of self-government in some matters, such as cultural affairs, but their autonomy is in fact very limited. Ethnic dissent continues to the present, although many groups appear to be content to be part of the Chinese empire. Tibetans. Tibet, with its long history of separate ethnic identity, has been especially problematic since the Chinese army conquered it in the early days of the PRC. The former government of Tibet never recognized Chinese authority, and many Tibetans today campaign for independence, while others demand enhanced autonomy under Chinese sovereignty. The movement rallies around the Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader who fled to India in 1959 after Tibet's failed uprising against China. There he set up a Tibetan government in exile that the Chinese Communist Party has never recognized. A series of riots and demonstrations took place in Tibet in March of 2008, on the 49th anniversary of the failed uprising, a situation that increased tensions between the Chinese government and the Dalai Lama. The Tibetan cause was highlighted in 2008 by protests that greeted the Olympic torch in some Western cities, as the runners made their way to Beijing, where the Olympics were held. In 2011, the government in exile elected a prime minister, signaling the withdrawal of the Dalai Lama from political leadership, although his spiritual roles remain intact. In July 2013, the Chinese government announced its intention to intensify a crackdown against illegal publications, such as pamphlets, text messages, and books in Tibetan regions in an attempt to control pro-Dalai Lama literature and publicity. Government figures show that more than 1.3 million illegal publications and promotional items were confiscated from 2011 to mid-2013 in the Tibet Autonomous Region. Uyghurs. A second group of people who has shown increasing unrest are the Uyghurs, who are Muslims of Turkish descent living in Xinjiang, very close to the borders with Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the Central Asian state of the former Soviet Union. Some Uyghur militants want to create a separate Islamic state and have used violence to support their cause. In the post-September 11th world, the Chinese have become very concerned with these Muslim dissidents. Their fears were confirmed in July 2009 when riots broke out in Urumqi, the capital city of Xinjiang. The riots were sparked by Uyghur dissatisfaction with the Chinese central government's handling of the deaths of 2 Uyghur workers during previous disruptions. But the violence was part of ongoing ethnic tensions between the Han and the Uyghurs. Although no large-scale riots have broken out since 2009, Uyghur unrest remains an issue. Discrimination remains a barrier for any Uyghurs who leave Xinjiang, and many find it difficult to get and hold a job because employers do not want Uyghurs as employees. The Chinese government has sponsored education and affirmative action programs, but most Uyghurs remain in Xinjiang, where job opportunities are limited. Linguistic diversity. Even among the Han Chinese, there is great linguistic diversity, although they have shared a written language for many centuries. Since its inception, the communist regime has tried to make Mandarin the official language of government and education. For example, in early 2006, China stepped up its repression of Shanghainese, a language which, in its various forms, is native to close to 100 million people, especially around Shanghai, China's largest city. Rules required most people in the public sector, including teachers and members of the broadcast media, to use Mandarin when addressing the public. In 2008, the Education Minister of Hong Kong lifted restrictions that forced many secondary schools to teach in Cantonese, reversing a policy adopted shortly after Hong Kong's return to China in 1997. One motivation was probably the results of a study that showed that students from English-speaking schools did far better in getting into universities than did those from Cantonese-speaking schools. Despite restrictions such as this, dialects remain embedded in Chinese society and demonstrate the difficulty that the centralized state has in imposing its will on huge territorial space. Urban-rural cleavages. An increasingly important divide in Chinese society is between rural and urban areas. Most of China's tremendous economic growth over the past few decades has taken place in cities. As a result, the gap between urban and rural incomes has grown to a point that some observers have redefined the meaning of two Chinas, this time a rural and urban one. The proportion of urban to rural population has also changed dramatically, with about 80% of Chinese living in the countryside in the early 1980s compared to about 47% today. The divide is not just economic, but also includes social lifestyle differences that form the basis for growing resentments across the countryside. One result has been an upsurge in protests in rural areas, where some believe that the government is not looking out for their interests. For example, a few years ago in Hunan province, thousands of angry farmers marched on the township government headquarters to protest excessive taxes and corruption of local officials. Shortly afterward, 9 people suspected of being leaders of the protests were arrested. In reaction to this discontent, Prime Minister Wen Jiabao announced in 2006 a new government emphasis on a new socialist countryside, a program to lift the lagging rural economy. He recognized the following year that the rural poor had an array of problems not shared by urban residents. One recent issue has to do with rural-born urban workers who are reaching retirement age. Under the hukou system, their pensions are far less than for city-born workers, requiring many to work past retirement age. Political participation. According to Chinese tradition before 1949, citizens are subjects of the government, not participants in a political system. The communist state redefined political participation by creating a relationship between the Communist Party and citizenship, and by shaping the economic relationship between citizens and the government. Nevertheless, old traditions that govern personal ties and relationships still mold China's political processes and influence the actions and beliefs of elites and citizens alike. In recent years, popular social movements that support democracy, religious beliefs, and community ties over nationalism have influenced Chinese politics and helped to define China's relationship with other countries. Party and participation. The Chinese Communist Party is the largest political party in the world in terms of total former membership, with about 858 million members in 2015. However, as was true in the USSR, its members make up only a small minority of the country's population. Only about 6% of the total population are members of the CCP. Only those that are judged to be fully committed to the ideals of communism and who are willing to devote a great deal of time and energy to party affairs may join. Party membership is growing, with new members recruited largely from the CCP's Youth League. Almost 89 million Chinese youths belong to the Youth League by 2015. The economic reforms begun by Deng Xiaoping paved the way for a milestone transition to the backgrounds of party members. During the Maoist era, before 1976, revolutionary cadres whose careers depended on party loyalty and ideological purity led the CCP at all levels. Most cadres were peasants or factory workers, and few were intellectuals or professionals. Since Deng's reforms, technocrats, people with technical training who climbed the ladder of the party bureaucracy, led the party increasingly. Over time, backgrounds of leaders have broadened, and many are the sons of earlier leaders. The Standing Committee members selected in 2012 have educations in economics, chemistry, engineering, and history, and all have long careers as party leaders. Today, less than 40% of party members come from the peasantry, although peasants still make up the largest single group within the CCP. The fastest growing membership category consists of officials, intellectuals, technicians, and other professionals. At the 18th National Congress in 2012, 512 of the 2,268 delegates were women, about 22.6%. However, women are far rarer in leadership positions, with only 205 members in the latest Central Committee. The number of women in the 25-member Politburo inducted in 2012 doubled to 2. No woman has ever been appointed to the highest tier of the Communist Party, the Politburo Standing Committee. A significant change in party membership came in 2001 with the decision to allow capitalists to become members. In a repudiation of Maoist principles, President Jiang Zemin argued that the CCP ought to represent not just workers and peasants, but business interests as well. According to some estimates, between a quarter and a third of all Chinese entrepreneurs are CCP members, a fact that significantly alters the traditional concept of cadre. The growth of civil society. In recent years, the control mechanisms of the party have loosened as new forms of associations appear, like Western-style discos and coffee houses. Communications through cell phones, fax machines, TV satellite dishes, and internet have made it more difficult for the party state to monitor citizens. An important new development is the growth of civil society, the appearance of private organizations that do not directly challenge the authority of the state, but focus on social problems such as the environment, AIDS, and legal reform. For example, recently activist organizations have protested government-sponsored dam projects that would flood the farmland of millions of peasants. The government is trying to harness water power for further industrial development, and even though the protesters will probably not block the projects, the very existence of these groups represents a major change. Hu Jintao announced a policy of harmonious development that allows the state to solicit public opinion before expanding the country's infrastructure or sponsoring economic development. However, citizens still complain that the government lacks transparency because it reveals its plans too late and in very obscure places. Such attitudes sparked demonstrations in early 2008 in Shanghai, when the government extended its train lines without notifying people whose property would be affected by the project. Many observers believe that the rising middle class in China is awakening to the responsibilities and privileges of citizenship. Activists had virtually no say in the Chinese political system until the 1990s, when Beijing allowed non-governmental organizations to register with the government. Today, China has thousands of NGOs, ranging from ping-pong clubs to environmentalist groups. A key test of China's tolerance is religion. Today, Christianity and Buddhism are rebounding after years of communist suppression of religion. Despite these changes, the government still keeps close control of these groups, with their 1999 to 2001 crackdown on the religious movement Falun Gong, a good example of the party's limited tolerance of activities outside the political realm. Protests. The Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989 showed the limits of protests in China. Massive repression was the government's message to its citizens that democratic movements that defy the party leadership will not be tolerated. In recent years, religious groups such as Falun Gong have staged major protests, but none have risen to the level of conflict apparent in 1989. Village protests have made their way into the news, and thousands of labor strikes have been reported. Some observers believe that protests will pose serious threats to the party in the near future. Riots in Tibet and protests to the torch relay. In recent years, the most serious protest movements have occurred in Tibet and Xinjiang, both autonomous regions in western China. In Tibet, a series of riots and demonstrations took place in Lhasa, Tibet's capital city, on March of 2008, on the 49th anniversary of the failed uprising against China in 1959. The protests became violent after 300 Buddhist monks demanded the release of other monks who'd been detained for several months. More political demands followed as Tibetans and non-Tibetan ethnic groups quarreled, and rioting, looting, burning, and killing began. China's premier, Wan Jiabo, accused the Dalai Lama of orchestrating the uprisings, a charge that the Dalai Lama denied, and tensions mounted between the two men. Riots followed in other provinces with Tibetan populations, and became serious enough that they drew international attention. One series of reactions to the Tibetan riots occurred along the route of the 2008 Summer Olympics torch relay. Called by the organizers a journey of harmony that was supposed to showcase the Olympics as China's symbolic connection to the rest of the world. In many cities along the route, the torch relay was met by protesters inspired most directly by the Tibetan riots, but who also objected to China's human rights record, the political status of Taiwan, and trade policies with Darfur, Myanmar, and Zimbabwe. The protests were particularly strong in Paris, where Chinese security services were forced to extinguish the flame. And in some places, San Francisco, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, the number of counter-protesters was higher than the number of protesters. Despite the chaos, the Olympics went on as planned without further major disruptions. Riots in Xinjiang. In July of 2009, riots broke out in Urumqi, the capital city of Xinjiang, in northwest China. The riots were sparked by Uyghur dissatisfaction with the Chinese central government's handling of the deaths of 2 Uyghur workers during previous disruptions. Protesters clashed with police, and after 3 days of rioting, President Hu Jintao left the G8 summit to return to China to give his full attention to the violence. The police tried to stop the rioters with tear gas, water hoses, and roadblocks, and armored vehicles, and the government strictly enforced curfews in most urban areas. Internet services were shut down, and cell phone service was restricted. Although the number of casualties was disputed, Xinhua, China's official news media, reported that the death toll from the riots was 197, and hundreds more were hospitalized. The Chinese government responded to riots in Tibet and Xinjiang with large numbers of arrests, followed by court hearings. The head of the Communist Party in Xinjiang promised that those who have committed crimes with cruel means would be executed. Although the vast majority of protests each year take place in rural areas, urban unrest, such as the recent riots by factory workers in the southern province of Guangdong, is now more common. Part of the unrest has to do with hukou, China's traditional household registration system that makes it difficult to move from one place to another. In the early days of Deng Xiaoping's reforms, hukou restrictions were loosened, allowing migrations from rural to urban areas. However, the largest cities now find themselves overcrowded, and so they are shutting down shelters for workers who have recently migrated from rural areas and erecting other barriers to entry for unskilled workers. For example, in Beijing, the number of automobile license plates issued in 2011 was limited to just 1/3 the number in 2010, and new rules also forbid partitioning flats for rent. With the government's announcement of its intentions to sponsor a massive program to move people from rural to urban areas, the hukou system almost certainly will change. One reaction to growing pressure to loosen restrictions comes from Shanghai, where migrant workers are divided into classes. Class A, the most educated and talented, get the Shanghai hukou, and the slightly less talented Class B might get hukou after 7 years to paying into the social security system. Everyone else has to wait longer.